After losing everything in a devastating fire, a humble man receives an unimaginable surprise. From his quiet neighbor no one knew was a country legend. The acrid smell of smoke pierced through Matthew Collins's dreams like a dagger, yanking him from the peaceful slumber he desperately needed after another grueling 16-hour workday. His weathered hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite countless scrubbings, instinctively reached across the empty side of the bed where Sarah had slept for 35 years. The cold sheets reminded him once again that she was gone, taken by cancer just 8 months ago, leaving him alone in their modest wooden home in Bandera, Texas. But tonight, something was terribly wrong. The smell wasn't coming from his dreams or memories of Sarah's last days in the hospital. This was real, immediate, and growing stronger with each passing second. Matthew's eyes snapped open, and his heart nearly stopped. Orange light flickered against the bedroom walls like demonic fingers reaching through the darkness, and the crackling sound that followed made his blood run cold. Fire. "Dear God, no," Matthew whispered, his voice hoarse from sleep and terror. He scrambled out of bed, his 58-year-old joints protesting as he stumbled toward the window. What he saw outside made his knees buckle. Flames were already consuming the front porch he had built with his own hands 20 years ago, the same porch where he and Sarah had spent countless evenings watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke was beginning to seep under the bedroom door. Matthew's mind raced as he grabbed the framed photograph of Sarah from his nightstand, the only thing that mattered more than his own life. He could hear the fire eating through the wooden structure like a hungry beast, devouring decades of memories, love, and hope in minutes. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling the same heartbreak we are, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on Matthew's incredible journey. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. Matthew wrapped a damp towel around his face and made his way through the smoke-filled hallway, coughing violently as the toxic fumes burned his lungs. The heat was so intense, it felt like walking through hell itself. Every step was a battle against panic and the overwhelming urge to collapse. Behind him, he could hear the groaning of wooden beams beginning to surrender to the inferno. The living room was already engulfed in flames when he reached it. The old recliner, where Sarah used to read her romance novels, was nothing but a skeleton of twisted metal and ash. The coffee table they had bought at a garage sale during their first year of marriage was crackling and popping as the fire consumed it greedily. 35 years of their life together was disappearing before his eyes. Matthew stumbled toward the front door, but the porch had already collapsed, blocking his escape route. Panic seized his chest like a vice as he realized he was trapped. The back door was his only hope, but he would have to cross through the kitchen, where he could already see flames dancing on the ceiling like orange demons celebrating their victory. "Sarah, if you're watching over me, I could use some help right about now," he gasped, clutching her photograph against his chest. As if in answer to his prayer, a section of the kitchen wall that hadn't yet caught fire provided a narrow path to the back door. Matthew ran faster than he had in years, feeling the heat searing the back of his neck as he burst through the back door and tumbled onto the grass 20 feet from the house. He turned around just in time to see his beloved home, the place where he had carried Sarah across the threshold as a young bride, where they had dreamed of children who never came, where they had nursed each other through sickness and celebrated every small victory. Completely surrendered to the flames, the volunteer fire department arrived within 15 minutes, their sirens wailing across the quiet countryside like banshees announcing doom. Chief Rodriguez, a man Matthew had known since childhood, approached him with grim eyes and a heavy heart. "Matthew, son, I'm so sorry," Rodriguez said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The electrical system in these old houses, sometimes there's just nothing anyone can do. At least you're alive, that's what matters." But as Matthew watched the firefighters battle the inferno that was consuming not just his house, but his entire life, he wondered if being alive was enough. The garage attached to the house was now engulfed in flames, and inside it was his 1987 Ford pickup truck, his mobile office, his toolbox, his livelihood. Every wrench, every socket, every piece of equipment he had accumulated over 4 decades of working as a mechanic was being reduced to molten metal and ash. The neighbors began arriving as word spread through the small community. Mrs. Henderson, from across the street, appeared with a blanket and a thermos of coffee. The Martinezes brought sandwiches they had hastily prepared. Young Tommy Patterson, barely 16 and apprenticing at the local auto shop, stood silent, with tears streaming down his face as he watched his mentor's world burn. "We'll help you rebuild, Matthew," Mrs. Henderson said with determination that reminded him of Sarah. "This community takes care of its own. You know that." But Matthew knew something the well-meaning neighbors didn't. The medical bills from Sarah's cancer treatment had drained every penny of their savings and then some. The insurance policy on the house had lapsed 3 months ago, when he had to choose between keeping the policy current and paying for Sarah's pain medication. The brutal mathematics of poverty in America had left him with no choice. Comfort for his dying wife trumped protecting their possessions. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Matthew sat on the ground, still clutching Sarah's photograph, watching the last embers of his old life die out. He had no money, no home, no tools, and no way to earn a living. At 58 years old, he was starting over with nothing but the clothes on his back and a lifetime of memories that couldn't pay bills or put food on a table. What Matthew didn't notice was the figure standing across the road, partially hidden by the early morning shadows cast by an old oak tree. The man wore a simple black cowboy hat, pulled low over his eyes, and leaned against a pickup truck, watching the scene with intense interest. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he observed the community rallying around Matthew, and something in his expression suggested this wasn't just the casual curiosity of a passerby. The stranger had been driving past when he saw the smoke and stopped to see if anyone needed help, but when he recognized the property and realized whose house was burning, his casual concern transformed into something much deeper and more personal. He had driven this road countless times over the past decade, always slowing down slightly when he passed Matthew's modest home, always remembering a debt that could never truly be repaid. As the sun climbed higher and the crowd around Matthew grew larger, the mysterious observer quietly climbed back into his truck and drove away. But anyone watching carefully might have noticed that he didn't head toward town like most of the other onlookers. Instead, he turned down a private road that led to one of the largest and most secluded ranches in the entire county. The ranch was known throughout Texas for its pristine pastures, prize-winning cattle, and the privacy it afforded its owner. Local residents rarely saw the man who lived there, though rumors swirled about his identity and wealth. Some said he was a retired oil executive. Others claimed he was a reclusive tech entrepreneur. A few whispered that he might be someone famous seeking refuge from the spotlight. What none of them knew was that their mysterious neighbor had just witnessed something that would change not only Matthew Collins' life forever, but would also reveal a connection between two men that spanned decades and would soon shock the entire community of Bandera, Texas, in ways none of them could possibly imagine. The stranger sat in his truck for a long moment after reaching his property, staring at Sarah's photograph that Matthew had pressed against the window of the fire chief's car. He remembered another night, many years ago, when kindness from a stranger had changed the course of his own life, and he wondered if fate was finally providing him with the opportunity to complete a circle that had been left open for far too long. 3 days after the fire, Matthew Collins found himself sitting on a hard wooden pew in the First Baptist Church of Bandera, surrounded by boxes of donated clothes that smelled like mothballs and good intentions. Pastor Williams had graciously offered him temporary shelter in the church's small guest room, a space normally reserved for visiting missionaries and traveling evangelists. The irony wasn't lost on Matthew. He felt like he needed a miracle himself. The clothes didn't fit properly. Nothing ever did when charity was involved. The pants were too long, the shirts too loose around his lean frame that had been carved by decades of crawling under car hoods and lifting heavy engine parts. But he was grateful, even if the gratitude felt hollow in his chest like an echo in an empty cathedral. Mrs. Henderson had organized a collection that raised $437.62. It was a fortune by the standards of their small community, where most families lived paycheck to paycheck, and a $100 emergency could mean choosing between electricity and groceries. But Matthew knew it wouldn't last long, especially without any way to earn more. "So you need to think about what you're going to do next, son," Pastor Williams said, settling his considerable bulk onto the pew beside Matthew. The old preacher had been counseling broken souls for over 40 years, and he recognized the look of a man who was drowning in despair. God doesn't close one door without opening another. Matthew wanted to believe that, But at 58 years old with no transportation, no tools and hands that shook slightly from a lifetime of physical labor, the doors seemed to be slamming shut one after another. He had already visited every auto repair shop within walking distance of town, and the response was always the same polite rejection. "I appreciate you thinking of us, Matthew, but we're not hiring right now," said Bob Hernandez at Bandera Auto Repair, not quite meeting his eyes. "Maybe try again in a few months when business picks up." The truth was harder to swallow than the polite lies. Who wanted to hire a nearly 60-year-old mechanic with no tools and no vehicle to get to work? The younger guys, fresh out of vocational school, came with energy, modern training on computer diagnostics, and no baggage from a lifetime of heartbreak. Matthew's second day of job hunting led him to Miller Construction, where Jake Miller, a stocky man in his 40s with arms like tree trunks and an attitude to match, looked him up and down like he was evaluating a broken-down piece of equipment. "You're the guy whose house burned down, right?" Miller asked, not waiting for an answer. "Listen, Collins, I feel bad for you. I really do. But construction isn't charity work. I need guys who can keep up, who have their own tools, who aren't going to miss work because of doctor appointments and old man problems." The words hit Matthew like physical blows, each one designed to remind him of his age, his circumstances, and his complete lack of value in the modern economy. Other workers on the construction site had stopped to listen, and Matthew could feel their pity radiating toward him like heat from a forge. "I've been working with my hands since I was 14 years old," Matthew said quietly, his voice carrying the dignity that 4 decades of honest labor had earned him. "I can outwork men half my age when I have the tools to do it." Miller laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the construction site like the screech of metal on metal. "Sure you can, old-timer. That's what they all say. But tools cost money, and reliable transportation costs money, and insurance costs money. You got any of that money, Collins?" The humiliation burned in Matthew's chest as he walked away from the construction site, Miller's laughter following him like a pack of dogs. He passed his reflection in the window of Martinez feed store and barely recognized the broken man staring back at him. When had his shoulders become so stooped? When had defeat carved such deep lines around his eyes? That evening, as Matthew sat alone in the church guest room, picking at a casserole that one of the congregation members had brought by, he allowed himself to remember the last time he had felt truly useful. It was almost 15 years ago, on a night when the October wind was howling across the Texas hill country like a lost soul searching for redemption. He had been driving home from a late-night repair job when he spotted the broken-down car on the side of Farm Road 1077. It was a newer model than most vehicles that ended up stranded on these rural roads, and something about it seemed out of place. But Matthew had never been able to drive past someone in trouble, no matter how tired he was or how much his back ached from bending over engine blocks all day. The young man standing beside the car was probably in his early 30s, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt that looked expensive even in the dim light of Matthew's flashlight. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from success, but his face showed genuine relief when Matthew pulled over. "Engine trouble?" Matthew had asked, grabbing his toolbox from the back of his truck. "Started making a terrible noise about 5 miles back, then just died," the stranger replied. "I don't know much about cars, I'm afraid. I was hoping to make it to San Antonio tonight." Matthew popped the hood and immediately spotted the problem. The serpentine belt had snapped, probably due to a seized pulley. It was the kind of repair that would cost $300 at a shop, but could be fixed on the roadside with the right knowledge and a $20 part. "Lucky for you, I keep spare belts in my truck," Matthew said, already reaching for his tools. "This'll take about 20 minutes. As he worked, the stranger tried to make conversation. He mentioned something about having a show in San Antonio the next night, and Matthew assumed he meant some kind of business presentation. The man seemed nervous about being late, checking his watch frequently and pacing beside the car. "You do this for a living?" the stranger asked, watching Matthew's hands work with practiced efficiency in the cramped engine compartment. 37 years next month," Matthew replied, not looking up from his work. "Started when I was 14, helping my daddy fix farm equipment. Been fixing things ever since. Must be satisfying work, helping people get back on the road." Matthew paused in his work and looked at the young man with curiosity. Most people saw mechanics as a necessary evil, someone to tolerate when their car broke down and to forget about as soon as possible. This stranger seemed genuinely interested in the craft. "It is," Matthew said simply. "Every problem has a solution if you're patient enough to find it." When the repair was finished and the engine purred back to life, the stranger reached for his wallet. "What do I owe you? This would have cost me a fortune at a garage, and you probably saved me from spending the night on the side of the road." Matthew shook his head and started packing up his tools. "Don't worry about it. Just help someone else when you get the chance." "Are you sure? I can afford to pay you properly for this." "I'm sure," Matthew said, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Good luck with your show tomorrow night." The stranger extended his hand. "I'm George, by the way, George Strait." Matthew shook the offered hand. "Matthew Collins. Drive safe now." As Matthew drove away that night, he didn't think much about the encounter. He helped stranded motorists several times a year, and rarely remembered their names or faces. It was just what neighbors did for each other in this part of Texas, where distances were vast and help could be hours away. He certainly had no idea that the polite young man he had helped would go on to become the undisputed king of country music, selling over 70 million records and earning a place in every major music hall of fame. Matthew didn't follow country music closely, preferring the classic rock that Sarah loved, and even if someone had told him that George Strait was famous, the name wouldn't have meant anything to him. Now, sitting in the church guest room with his life in ruins around him, Matthew wondered if kindness really did come back around the way people always claimed it did. He had helped countless people over the years, given away free repairs to struggling families, and always believed that doing right by others was its own reward. But tonight, with his stomach growling and his future looking bleaker than a Texas drought, Matthew Collins found himself questioning whether goodness was enough to sustain a man when the world seemed determined to grind him into dust. Outside his window, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the glass like fingers drumming impatiently on a table. What Matthew didn't know was that across town, in the sprawling ranch house that most of Bandera's residents had never seen, someone else was staring at the same storm clouds and remembering that same night 15 years ago with perfect clarity. The man in the ranch house had never forgotten the mechanic who had refused payment for his kindness, and he had been waiting for an opportunity to repay that debt for over a decade. Tomorrow would bring possibilities that neither man could imagine, and a revelation that would transform not just Matthew's circumstances, but his understanding of how deeply one act of kindness could resonate through the years. The storm approaching Bandera carried more than just rain. It carried the seeds of redemption, planted long ago on a dark highway and about to bloom in ways that would astound everyone who witnessed it. The rain that had threatened the night before arrived with vengeance just after dawn, turning the unpaved parking lot of the First Baptist Church into a muddy quagmire that sucked at Matthew's worn boots as he made his way to the small diner where he hoped to find day labor. The storm had kept him awake most of the night, not because of the thunder and lightning, but because each raindrop against the window reminded him that he had no roof of his own to shelter under. At Rosie's diner, the usual crowd of ranchers and construction workers huddled over steaming cups of coffee, discussing the weather and the price of cattle feed. Matthew approached several tables, hat in hand, asking if anyone needed help with repairs or manual labor. The responses were polite but firm. Nobody was hiring, especially not in this weather. "Sorry, Matthew," said Earl Jacobson, a local rancher who had known him for 20 years. "Wish I could help, but we're tightening our belts this season. Maybe when things turn around." It was the same story everywhere. The economic reality of small-town Texas was harsh enough when you had transportation and tools. Without them, it was nearly impossible. Matthew bought a cup of coffee with some of the donation money, more for the warmth than the caffeine, and sat alone at a corner table watching the rain streak down the windows. "Heard you've been looking for work," said a gravelly voice behind him. Matthew turned to see Roy Hutchins, a local handyman who worked odd jobs around town. Roy was younger than Matthew by about 10 years, but hard living had aged him prematurely. His face was weathered like old leather, and his hands bore the permanent stains of a man who worked with grease and dirt for a living. "That's right," Matthew replied, gesturing for Roy to sit down. "You know of anything?" Roy settled into the booth with a grunt. "Might be something. Lady out on Riverside Drive needs some plumbing work done. Pipes froze last winter and burst. Been putting off fixing it because contractors want too much money." Matthew felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. "I've done plumbing work before, not my specialty, but I know my way around pipes." "Problem is you'd need tools and transportation," Roy continued, crushing Matthew's brief optimism. "She's about 8 miles out of town and the job would take most of a day. Plus, she's the kind of woman who expects things done right the first time." "I understand," Matthew said quietly, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added sugar or cream. "Thanks for thinking of me anyway." Roy studied Matthew's face for a moment, seeing something that made him uncomfortable. "Look, Matthew, I know things are tough right now. If I had room for a partner—" "Don't worry about it," Matthew interrupted, not wanting to hear another polite rejection. "Something will turn up." But as the morning wore on, Matthew began to wonder if anything would turn up. He walked through town in the rain, stopping at every business that might need help. The auto parts store didn't need anyone. The farm supply company was cutting hours, not adding workers. Even the grocery store, which sometimes hired part-time help for stocking shelves, had no openings. By noon, Matthew's clothes were soaked through, and his shoes squelched with every step. He made his way back toward the church, dreading another afternoon of sitting alone with his thoughts and his failures. But as he rounded the corner onto Church Street, he stopped dead in his tracks. Parked directly in front of the First Baptist Church, gleaming despite the rain, sat a brand-new Ford F-250 pickup truck. It was metallic blue, with chrome bumpers that reflected the grey sky like mirrors. Even from a distance, Matthew could see that the bed was loaded with something covered by a pristine blue tarp. Several townspeople had gathered around the truck, talking in hushed, excited voices. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with the Martinez family and young Tommy Patterson from the auto shop. They all turned to look at Matthew as he approached, their faces wearing expressions of amazement and barely contained excitement. "Matthew!" Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "You need to see this." As Matthew drew closer, he could see that the truck's windows were rolled down slightly, and there was an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. His name was written on the outside in neat, careful handwriting that looked somehow familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen it before. "Nobody saw who left it," said Carlos Martinez, shaking his head in disbelief. "Rosa was watching from our kitchen window, and one minute the street was empty, the next minute this truck was just sitting here." Matthew's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note on expensive paper that felt substantial between his fingers. The message was brief, but profound in its simplicity. 15 years ago, you helped a stranger on Farm Road 1077. You wouldn't take payment then, saying I should help someone else when I got the chance. Today is that day. The truck and everything in it are yours. This isn't charity. It's a circle completing itself. Use them well, and remember that kindness always finds its way home. The note was signed simply GS, but somehow those initials stirred something in Matthew's memory, like a song heard from a great distance. Tommy Patterson had pulled back the tarp covering the truck bed, and his gasp of amazement drew everyone's attention. The bed was filled with the most beautiful set of professional mechanics tools Matthew had ever seen. Socket sets in gleaming chrome, wrenches of every size arranged in perfect order, diagnostic equipment that he had only dreamed of owning, and an air compressor that looked like it belonged in a professional garage. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Roy Hutchins, who had followed Matthew from the diner. "That's got to be $20,000 worth of tools in there." Matthew climbed into the truck with trembling hands, hardly daring to believe this was real. The interior smelled like new leather and possibility. The seats were heated, the dashboard was equipped with GPS navigation and a premium sound system, and hanging from the rear-view mirror was a small cross that reminded him of the one Sarah used to wear around her neck. As he turned the key in the ignition, the engine came to life with a smooth, powerful rumble that vibrated through his chest, like a heartbeat. For the first time since the fire, Matthew Collins felt tears of joy rather than despair streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Who would do something like this?" asked Mrs. Henderson, dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief. "Someone who understands what it means to be helped when you need it most," Matthew replied, though he was beginning to suspect he knew exactly who that someone might be. Pastor Williams emerged from the church, drawn by the commotion, and his eyes widened as he took in the scene. "Matthew, what in heaven's name is going on here?" "A miracle, Pastor," Matthew said simply. "A genuine miracle." But even as the word miracle left his lips, Matthew was remembering that night 15 years ago with startling clarity. The broken-down car, the nervous young man who had mentioned having a show in San Antonio, the way he had said his name with a slight pause, as if he was used to it, meaning something to people. George Strait. G.S. Matthews' heart began to race as the pieces fell into place. Could it really be possible that the scared young man he had helped on that dark highway had grown up to become one of the most famous entertainers in the world? And more importantly, had that same man been living practically next door to him all these years, quietly waiting for the right moment to repay an old debt? The rain had stopped while Matthew sat in his new truck, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. As if on cue, the sound of another vehicle approaching made everyone turn. A modest pickup truck, much older and more weathered than Matthew's new one, pulled up across the street. The driver was a man in his 60s, wearing a simple black cowboy hat and faded jeans. He sat in his truck for a moment, seemingly content to observe the celebration from a distance. But when his eyes met Matthew's through the windshield of the new Ford, something passed between them that the gathering crowd couldn't understand. Recognition, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from a debt finally being paid. The man in the cowboy hat touched the brim of his hat in a subtle salute, then drove away as quietly as he had arrived, but not before Matthew caught a glimpse of the license plate on his truck, which read simply, Strait. The crowd around Matthew's new truck continued to marvel and speculate about the identity of his mysterious benefactor, but Matthew sat quietly in the driver's seat, overwhelmed by the realization that the simple act of helping a stranded motorist had resonated across 15 years and resulted in this incredible gift. He thought about Sarah and how she always believed that goodness would be rewarded, even when it seemed like the world was determined to prove her wrong. Tomorrow Matthew would drive his new truck to the lady's house on Riverside Drive and fix her plumbing. He would do the job better than any contractor she could have hired, and he would charge her a fair price that reflected the value of honest work done right. And for the first time since the fire, he would go to sleep knowing that he had a future worth looking forward to. But tonight, as the sun set over Bandera and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Matthew Collins simply sat in his new truck and marveled at the mysterious ways that kindness could travel through time, growing and multiplying until it returned home transformed into something greater than its humble beginning. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust from the Texas landscape. Matthew woke before sunrise, something he hadn't done since the fire, with a sense of purpose that felt foreign after so many days of despair. The new truck keys lay on the nightstand beside Sarah's photograph, catching the early light like a promise of better days ahead. By 7 o'clock, Matthew was driving through the countryside toward Riverside Drive, marveling at how smoothly the F-250 handled the winding farm roads. The GPS system guided him effortlessly to Mrs. Elena Vasquez's modest ranch house, where broken pipes had left her without running water for 2 weeks. She was a widow in her 70s who had been putting off the expensive repair while trying to survive on a fixed income. "You must be Matthew," she said, stepping onto her front porch as he pulled into her driveway. "Roy Hutchins called and said you might be able to help me. I have to warn you, 3 different contractors have quoted me over $1,500 for this job." Matthew smiled as he began unloading his pristine tools from the truck bed. "Let me take a look first, Mrs. Vasquez. I don't believe in giving estimates until I understand exactly what needs to be done." The plumbing problem was extensive, but not impossible. Frozen pipes had burst in 3 different locations, requiring replacement of sections in the bathroom, kitchen, and utility room. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive job that contractors love to overcharge for. Knowing that desperate customers had no choice but to pay, Matthew worked with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 44 years solving mechanical problems. His new tools responded to his experienced hands like extensions of his own body, and he found himself whistling while he worked, something he hadn't done since before Sarah's diagnosis. "You're very good at this, Mrs. Vasquez observed, bringing him a glass of sweet tea during his lunch break. "Those other men who came out here spent more time on their phones than looking at my pipes." "Every problem deserves your full attention," Matthew replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's what my father taught me when I was young." By 4 o'clock, water was flowing perfectly through every faucet in the house. Matthew had replaced the damaged sections with high-quality materials and added insulation to prevent future freeze damage. When Mrs. Vasquez asked about payment, Matthew handed her a bill for $350, less than a quarter of what the contractors had quoted. "This can't be right," she said, staring at the invoice. "You've been here all day, and the work is perfect." "It's right," Matthew assured her. "Fair payment for honest work." As he drove back toward town with his first earned money since the fire folded in his wallet, Matthew felt something he had almost forgotten: pride in his abilities and hope for the future. But his good mood was shattered when he stopped at the gas station on the outskirts of Bandera and encountered Jake Miller standing beside his own pickup truck. "Well, well," Miller said with a sneer that carried across the parking lot. "Look who found himself a sugar daddy. Nice truck, Collins. Wonder what you had to do to earn it." The insult hit Matthew like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm as he filled his tank. "Just trying to get back on my feet, Jake. No harm in that." "Back on your feet?" Miller laughed harshly. "You're 58 years old with no prospects and no future. That fancy truck doesn't change the fact that you're a washed-up has-been living on charity." Several other customers at the gas station had stopped to listen, and Matthew could feel their stares like hot coals against his skin. Miller was enjoying the audience, feeding off the humiliation he was inflicting. "Someone obviously felt sorry for you," Miller continued, his voice growing louder and more cruel. "Probably some bleeding-heart liberal who thinks throwing money at problems solves everything. But charity trucks don't change reality, old man. You're still worthless." That's when another voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see a man stepping out of a black pickup truck that had pulled up quietly during Miller's tirade. He was wearing jeans, boots, and a simple white button-down shirt, with a black cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. There was something about his presence that commanded immediate attention, an easy confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. Miller squinted at the newcomer, clearly trying to place him. "This is a private conversation, friend. Why don't you mind your own business?" The stranger stepped closer, and Matthew could see his face clearly for the first time since that night 15 years ago. George Strait looked older, more weathered by time and success, but his eyes held the same kindness that Matthew remembered from their roadside encounter. "My name is George Strait," he said simply, and the effect on the gathering crowd was immediate and electric. "And Matthew Collins is my business." Miller's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then pale shock as he realized exactly who he had been performing for. Several people pulled out their phones, but George raised a hand and somehow conveyed without words that this wasn't the time for pictures or videos. "So you seem to have some strong opinions about charity and worthless people," George continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "Let me tell you something about Matthew Collins. 15 years ago, when I was nobody special, he stopped on a dark highway to help a stranger. He fixed my car with his own tools, refused payment, and sent me on my way with nothing but kindness." The gas station had become completely silent, except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway. George's voice carried clearly to every person present. That stranger went on to sell over 70 million records and play for millions of people around the world. But more importantly, he never forgot the lesson that Matthew taught him that night, that helping others isn't about what you get back, it's about what you give forward. Miller looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt beneath his feet. "Mr. Strait, I didn't know, I was just—" "You were just showing everyone exactly what kind of man you are," George interrupted. "Matthew Collins has more integrity in his little finger than you've shown in your entire life. He's not living on charity. He's receiving what he earned through decades of kindness and honest work." George turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "I bought that truck and those tools because Matthew Collins changed my life. He showed me that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by how willing you are to help others when they need it most." The country music legend then did something that stunned everyone present. He walked over to Matthew and extended his hand for a firm handshake. "It's good to see you again, Matthew. I've been hoping for a chance to properly thank you for what you did for me all those years ago." Matthew felt tears welling up in his eyes as he grasped George's hand. "You didn't owe me anything, George. I was just doing what anyone would do." "That's exactly what makes you special," George replied. "You think kindness is ordinary when it's actually extraordinary." Jake Miller had retreated to his truck, clearly hoping to escape without further humiliation. But George wasn't finished with him yet. "Miller," he called out, and the contractor froze with his hand on his door handle. "I understand you're in the construction business. I'm planning a project that's going to need a lot of work. Quality work done by people with integrity. I'll be sure to ask around about who in this town can be trusted to do things right. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. In a small community like Bandera, word traveled fast, and George Strait's recommendation, or lack thereof, could make or break a local business. As Miller drove away with his tail between his legs, George turned back to Matthew with a smile that reminded him of their first meeting. "I hope you don't mind, but I've taken the liberty of making some additional arrangements. Nothing too dramatic, but I think you'll find the next few weeks interesting." "George, you've already done more than enough," Matthew protested. "The truck and tools are more than I could ever repay." "Repay?" George laughed, a sound that carried genuine warmth. "Matthew, you're thinking about this all wrong. You invested in a scared young man 15 years ago, and now you're seeing the returns on that investment. Besides, I have a feeling we're just getting started." As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Matthew to shake his hand and express their amazement. Word was already spreading through Bandera like wildfire. Their quiet neighbor was the king of country music, and he had just publicly declared Matthew Collins to be a man worthy of respect and admiration. Young Tommy Patterson from the auto shop was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Collins, this is incredible. Do you realize what just happened? George Strait just told everyone that you're his friend." But Matthew was looking past the excitement and celebrity worship to something more profound. In George's eyes, he had seen a reflection of his own values, the belief that people should be judged by their actions rather than their circumstances, and that true success was measured by how much good you could do for others. "Tommy," Matthew said quietly, "the most incredible part isn't that George Strait is famous. It's that fame didn't change the kind of man he is underneath." As the sun began to set over Bandera, Matthew drove his new truck back toward the church where he was staying, but his mind was already racing ahead to possibilities he hadn't dared to imagine just 24 hours earlier. George had hinted at additional arrangements, and Matthew suspected that his journey back from the ashes was far from over. Behind him, in a black pickup truck that maintained a respectful distance, George Strait followed the same route while making phone calls on his hands-free system. He was setting in motion a series of events that would soon transform not just Matthew's life, but the entire community of Bandera in ways that would be talked about for generations to come. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the gas station, Matthew's new life had taken on a rhythm that felt both familiar and miraculous. Word had spread throughout the hill country about the mechanic who had earned George Strait's personal endorsement, and Matthew's phone, a simple device that George had insisted on providing, rang constantly with repair requests. He had moved out of the church guest room and into a small apartment above Martinez feed store, paying honest rent with money he had earned through his own skill and effort. Every morning, he would wake up grateful for the sound of his alarm clock and the promise of meaningful work ahead. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Matthew received a call that would change everything once again. "Matthew, this is George. I wonder if you might have some time this afternoon to take a drive with me. There's something I'd like to show you." An hour later, George picked Matthew up in his modest pickup truck, not one of the luxury vehicles that his success could easily afford, but the same weathered Ford that he had driven for years around Bandera. They drove in comfortable conversation through the rolling hills east of town, discussing everything from engine repair techniques to the challenges of maintaining authenticity in an increasingly complicated world. "You know, Matthew," George said as they turned down a dirt road that Matthew didn't recognize, "success has a funny way of changing people's expectations of you. Everyone wants you to be larger than life, to live in a mansion and drive fancy cars and forget where you came from. But you never forgot," Matthew observed, watching the familiar landscape roll past his window. "How could I?" George replied. "Every time I drive past the spot where you helped me, I remember that the most important moment in my career wasn't winning a Grammy or selling 1,000,000 records. It was learning from a stranger that character matters more than status." They crested a small hill, and George pulled the truck to a stop beside a for sale sign that had been planted in front of a large, flat piece of land. The property stretched for several acres, with mature oak trees providing natural shade, and a small creek running along the back boundary. "What do you think of this spot?" George asked, stepping out of the truck and gesturing across the land. Matthew followed him, confused but curious. "It's beautiful. Good drainage, easy access to the main road. Why are we here?" George smiled and pulled a folded set of papers from his shirt pocket. "Because as of yesterday, this land belongs to you." Matthew stared at the papers, a property deed with his name clearly printed as the owner, and felt his knees go weak. "George, I can't accept this. You've already done too much." "Look at those papers more carefully," George said gently. "This isn't a gift. It's a business partnership." As Matthew read through the documents, George explained his vision. The land would be the site of Collins Classic Auto Repair, a state-of-the-art facility that would serve both the local community and George's growing collection of vintage vehicles. Matthew would own 60% of the business, with George holding the remaining 40% as a silent partner. "I've been collecting classic cars for years," George continued, "but I've never found a mechanic I trust completely to maintain them properly. Most shops these days are all about computers and modern diagnostics. They don't understand the soul of a 1967 Mustang or a 72 Chevelle." Matthew's mind was reeling as George outlined the plans. The shop would include 4 service bays, a paint booth, a parts storage area, and even a small museum section where some of George's rarest vehicles could be displayed for the public to enjoy. Local contractors, carefully vetted for their integrity and excluded Jake Miller entirely, would begin construction within the month. "But why?" Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you invest this much in someone you barely know?" George was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the land where Matthew's new future would be built. 15 years ago, you taught me something that all the success in the world couldn't teach. You showed me that helping others isn't about getting credit or recognition. It's about seeing potential in people and giving them the tools to achieve it." He turned to face Matthew directly, his expression serious but warm. "I've been successful beyond my wildest dreams, Matthew. I've got more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, more awards than I have wall space for, and more accolades than any one person deserves. But none of that means anything if I don't use it to continue the cycle of kindness that you started." Over the following months, the construction of Collins Classic Auto Repair became the most talked-about project in Bandera's history. George maintained his promise to remain a silent partner, but his influence was felt in every detail. The facility that took shape was unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Professional-grade equipment, spotless work areas, and an attention to detail that reflected both Matthew's standards and George's resources. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early autumn, when the Texas heat had finally broken and the hill country was painted in the golden light that made everything look like a scene from a movie. The entire community turned out for the celebration, along with several of George's friends from the music industry who had heard about the project and wanted to show their support. Matthew stood in the main service bay, wearing a crisp new uniform shirt with Collins Classic Auto Repair embroidered on the pocket, greeting neighbors and customers with a confidence that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. Mrs. Vasquez was there, along with Roy Hutchins, Tommy Patterson, and dozens of others who had watched Matthew's transformation with amazement and admiration. "You've come a long way from sleeping in the church guest room," Pastor Williams observed, shaking Matthew's hand with genuine pride. "Sometimes God's plan takes a while to reveal itself," Matthew replied, "but it's always worth the wait." As the afternoon wore on, the crowd was treated to tours of the facility, demonstrations of the vintage car restoration process, and plenty of barbecue provided by George's catering friends from Austin. But the highlight of the day was still to come. Just as the sun began to set behind the oak trees, a small stage that had been set up near the customer lounge area was suddenly occupied by a familiar figure with an acoustic guitar. George Strait had made his promised appearance, not as a celebrity making a grand entrance, but as a neighbor celebrating a friend's success. "Folks," George said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, "I want to tell you a story about a man who changed my life without even knowing it." He proceeded to tell the complete story of that night 15 years ago, when a broken-down car and a stranger's kindness had set in motion the chain of events that led to this moment. As he spoke, Matthew felt tears streaming down his face, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of gratitude for a journey that had taken him from the lowest point of his life to heights he had never imagined possible. "Matthew Collins represents everything that's good about Texas and everything that's good about America," George continued. "He works hard, treats people fairly, and never forgets that success is measured by how much you lift up others along the way." Then George began to play, his fingers finding the familiar chords of Troubadour, a song about legacy and the values that endure through time. His voice, unmistakable and pure, carried across the evening air as hundreds of people stood in respectful silence, witnessing a moment that none of them would ever forget. As the last notes faded away, George set down his guitar and walked over to Matthew, pulling him into a heartfelt embrace that spoke volumes about the friendship that had grown from that first chance encounter on a dark highway. "Thank you," Matthew whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," George replied, "for showing me that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold. They can only be shared." In the months that followed, Colin's classic auto repair became more than just a successful business. It became a symbol of what was possible when kindness and opportunity intersected. Matthew hired 3 full-time mechanics, including Tommy Patterson, who had finally found a mentor worthy of his enthusiasm. He also started an apprenticeship program for young people who wanted to learn the trade, ensuring that the values of craftsmanship and integrity would be passed on to the next generation. The shop became a destination for classic car enthusiasts from across Texas, drawn not just by the quality of the work but by the story behind it. George's vintage collection, which included everything from a pristine 1969 Camaro to a fully restored 1956 Thunderbird, served as both inspiration and advertisement for Matthew's skills. But perhaps most importantly, Matthew never forgot the lesson that had brought him to this point. When young mechanics fresh out of vocational school came looking for work, he gave them opportunities to prove themselves. When customers faced financial hardship, he found ways to work within their budgets, and when stranded motorists broke down near the shop, he still grabbed his tools and headed out to help, just as he had done on that fateful night 15 years earlier. On quiet evenings, when the last customer had gone home and the shop was peaceful in the golden Texas twilight, Matthew would sometimes stand in his office and look at the framed photograph of Sarah that held a place of honor on his desk. He would tell her about his day, about the cars he had fixed and the people he had helped, and he knew she would be proud of the man he had become through adversity. The circle that had begun with a simple act of kindness on Farm Road 1077 was now complete, but its influence continued to ripple outward through the community of Bandera and beyond. Matthew Collins had learned that sometimes losing everything is just the first step toward finding out what truly matters, and that the most valuable currency in the world isn't money or fame. It's the willingness to help others when they need it most. And on clear nights when the stars shone bright over the Texas hill country, both Matthew and George would sometimes drive past that spot on Farm Road 1077 where their paths had first crossed, remembering the moment when a stranger's kindness had planted the seeds of a friendship that would change both their lives forever.